Thanks for joining us for a discussion on education in China. This event is sponsored by Georgetown University's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. I am Ning Ling, the moderator of today's event. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the McCourt School of Public Policy here at Georgetown University. Today, we'll discuss the nature and future of education in China, where college has long been viewed as a key pathway for social mobility across classes, and where higher education is also central to building the workforce behind economic growth and technology competition. China has expanded education dramatically and invested heavily in universities and research, with visible payoffs in rising global rankings and research output. But beneath those headlines, the big questions are about how the system works now and where it's heading. How has the Chinese education system evolved over time, especially the Gaokao, the high-stakes national college entrance exam that shapes life chances for millions? How have Chinese family strategies changed, from school choice and tutoring to mobility? And increasingly, how does studying abroad fit into this landscape? A report citing UNESCO data estimates that about 1.05 million Chinese students were studying abroad in 2022, and China has been long the world's largest source country for international students. Studying abroad is a pathway to opportunity, but maybe it's also a hedge against domestic competition and the signal in China's changing education market. To explore these questions and trends, today we're joined by two experts on education in China, Dr. Rui Xuejia and Dr. Si Tu. Dr. Jia is a professor of economics at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. She also serves as co-director of the China Data Lab there. Dr. Jia's research lies at the intersections of economics, history, and politics, with a focus on how power structures evolve and shape economic development. In 2025, Dr. Jia co-authored a best-selling book called The Highest Exam: How the Gaokao Shapes China, that explores how China's education system both mirrors and molds its society. This book was ranked as one of the best books of 2025 by The Economist. And we have Dr. Si Tu, a sociologist and a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. There, she leads the development of the Mobility Lab and works on the global mobility of young people and transnational elite education. Dr. Tu's scholarly interests are focused on issues of global citizenship, elite education, international migration, and contemporary Chinese societies. She has a forthcoming book titled Destination Diploma: How Chinese upper middle class families outsource secondary education to the United States, where she investigates why and how Chinese upper middle class families made educational decisions to send their children to the United States for private high schools. So, without further ado, let's start with Dr. Rui Xuejia to give us some opening remarks.
Okay. Let me first share the slides. I'll just share some facts first. Can you see my slides? Okay. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss education in China. I want to start with something a bit funny or something a bit light, because it's a very important and heavy topic in some sense when you speak about education in China. So I was curious about, in today's world, we all know that education, Chinese are obsessed with education, but does AI know about this? So you can ask ChatGPT or other AI models, what are the top meal conversation topics in China and in the US? Surprise or not surprise, actually AI also knows that children's education and academic performance is the #1 topic in meal times, whereas this is not ranked among the top ones in the US context. And this obsession with education is not only about talking, right? It's also about money, resources, and energy. So this is some data we look at using household survey. This tells us, like, across countries, what's the household spending share among all household expenditure. And China clearly stand out, right? It's kind of confirms this obsession. It's a lot of money and energy spent on children's education. I just want to clarify that this is household, this is private spending, it's household spending, it's not government spending. If you look at the government spending data, China is not too special. It's like about a bit less than 4% in the world. It's actually much lower than many other like developed economies. So, so the one feature of Chinese education and obsession is this actually comes a lot from the families. Also, you can think the burden is largely falls on the shoulder of the families. And when we talk about the education, the Gaokao, the National College Entrance Exam, is certainly the highlight or the peak of this education system. As we know, at its heart, China's education system is exam-centered system, right? And Gaokao is really the national tournament, the symbol of this exam system at its peak. So, and this kind of exam-centered education system has been there for long, as we all know that it has its can be dated back to the Keju in Imperial China, which started around the 600 SAE, right? So think about that; it's over like 1400 years now. And today's Gaokao was created in the 1950s, and it was stopped during the Cultural Revolution and restated in 1977. And you'll see, it's a lot of parallel of the historical version and the today's version. So what I want to share a little bit about the main idea from a recent book Ning mentioned in the introduction. So I am economist. I'm mainly a political economist. I've been working on China's education system, especially the exam system, both its historical version and today's version for about 15 years. My co-author, Hongbin Li, who is 12 years older than me, has been working on this even longer. So we are asking ourselves, after studying this system for so long, after writing several papers, what can we share? What can we learn? What did we learn from this working on this system? What can we share from the general public? And that with the general public, that motivated us to write a book. We are both economists. You may know, I don't know whether the audience know, among different social sciences, economists don't really write books. So because it's not rewarded, it doesn't count in our evaluation system. So if we are the minority of economists who want to write a book with obviously the intentions to communicate with the general public, with people in other fields. So I'm kind of very eager to join this discussion and look forward to your questions and the feedback. It's a book that covers many aspects, but I want just to try today, with the very limited time, I just want to share the main idea is how we think about this system, which we characterize as a centralized hierarchical tournament implemented by many exams. I will talk a little bit what these three words mean. And the idea is once you have it's a framework, it's like a lens. Once you wear it, you can use it to understand the different phenomena, including behaviors of families, of the state and the society. In the book, we discuss different implications of such a system, including US-China competition in this age and Chinese immigrants in the US. So, but first, let me explain what this framework means, what does this tournament means. So let me start with the hierarchical part. And if you grew up in China or in East Asia society, it's pretty familiar. Yeah, these are hierarchical societies. Historically, the hierarchy was pretty clear, right? On the top of this hierarchy, the gentry class. If you pass the imperial exam, you actually enter the gentry class. And today it's much more complicated, right? This hierarchy is multi-dimensional. It's a hukou, rural versus urban. It's a profession. It's like occupation, professors versus the migrant workers. It's income, rich entrepreneurs versus poor peasants. And education itself is very hierarchical, right? If you're from the Beida, Tsinghua is in really the top of the top, there's hierarchy within the hierarchy, but there's multiple tiers, as you some of you know well. So on the one hand, in the past 40 years, China has changed so much. Many things have changed. On the other hand, there's something very, very stable. So one one stable feature, striking this college students' preference to work for the state sector. So these are some large-scale survey my co-author did when he was at Tsinghua every year across like 90 colleges in China, and you will see that over time, you'll see this like predominantly, if you ask college graduates which sector if they could work for, which is the ideal sector, and the answer is the state sector. This include government, public institutions, and state-owned enterprises. And if this is done like by 2015, now with economics slowing down, I imagine if you ask students these preferences, it would be even more clear that there will be even more students want to join the state sector. So you can think today's state sector is a bit like 21st century gentry class. And to join this sector, you needed to have often like elite college status. These credentials matter a lot, right? And that's kind of part of the story why people want to get into a better college so that they can get a better job. And another important feature of this system is a tournament, right? To be a tournament, there has to be two characteristics. First, there should be clear rule, simple, transparent rule. And the second is that there has to be some measurable objective criteria. And you can think the test score is such a criteria, and the people are ranked based on this single dimension and this clear, transparent rule. And this is really the first lesson or tournament for most Chinese, I would say, because most of us didn't really start with like sports, which is also a tournament. So being a tournament, what's special about it? There's one important characteristics of this system is that selection is crucial. It's a bit ironic, even though it's an education system, its primary function is selection. Education is a second order in some sense, because you can think education selection is I select relatively hardworking and intelligent people. And then education means value added. Given the same intelligence and family background, education brings more to the human capital. So a selection is a primary function. It's very effective, such a system, in doing selection. And ranking is crucial in such a selection system. And it's also happened fairly earlier, right? Like the college selection happened at age 18 or 19, right? And as we all know, this college, your undergraduate degree, looms large in your life, right? It's even my PhD student, Chinese PhD student at the UCSD. UCSD is a pretty good school. Nevertheless, when they decided to go back to Chinese academia, they still, worried that, oh, I didn't graduate from Tsinghua Beida for my undergrad degree, right? And this is, academia just a small part of a large society, right? As we all know, in the labor market, there's this undergraduate, this first degree discrimination in the labor market. And this another important feature of this system is a centralized system. The education system started not as education again, it started as a governance mechanism, right, to select able people to help the ruler govern the society. And you can think of the Gaokao, the national entrance exam, is really an annual tournament. It happened around the same day, across the whole country, right? And the college admission is governed by a centralized quota system, determined not only how many students would go to each college, but also across region has quotas, across fields has quotas, right? And this centralized system is not only about college per se, right? If you look at the whole system, including the K-12, the pre-college school is largely a bureaucratic centralized system. One interesting feature is the school officials have a bureaucratic ranks, right? Which is kind of special with these Chinese characteristics. Such a system also has its strengths and weaknesses. The weaknesses, is like with such a system, if the government made mistakes, it's kind of very, very costly, right? If the government, cannot predict the future of labor market, such as the economic slowing down, then unemployment of graduates will become a problem. But such a system also has its strengths. It can expand very quickly and can also serve the state priority very effectively. So one important change in the Chinese college education is the expansion since the 1999, right? The number of college enrollment increased from 1 million a year around the earlier 2000 to now over 10 million a year, right? That brings a lot of strength to the human capital in China. So here, just a figure to compare China and the US, right? This dramatic slope change around 1999 is indicates the college expansion, right? So this means the quantitatively the number of college graduates is much higher. It's 4 to 5 times the US counterpart. But another feature is that it's not only about the quantity, it's also about the type of human capital, right? The STEM fields, which is governed by a quota system, and in China, the share of STEM college students is about 50%, and in the US, it's about 20 to 30%. If you multiply the quantity and the type, then that means the number of STEM graduates in China is 10 times that of US counterpart, right? That certainly gives China an edge in this age of technology computation between these two countries. I don't want to spend too much time. I'll stop here, but I just say once you have this framework, you can use it to understand the obsession of families and rulers and how why society like such a system, what's the problem and the limitation of such a system. I'll leave this discussion maybe a bit later to questions and the discussion with Ning and Siqi. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jia. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Tu to discuss the patterns of Chinese students going abroad for education.
Can you see the slides now?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Rachel, for really thorough an introduction of this whole Gaokao induced education-related story. So I will try to speak a bit less so we can have more time for discussion. I just want to provide a little bit of overview of what has changed in the past 15 years. So it's more like a stats. Some 3 graphs I will show you what has changed in the past 15 years, and then give you a little bit of bite of my own ethnographic work, which is on why Chinese families and how Chinese upper middle class families are sending their children as young as 14 to US for private high schools. So as you can see from this first graph, that from 2010-ish to 2025, the number of Chinese international students actively in the US has peaked around a little bit right before the pandemic. And then you can see a sharp decline, which is 100%, almost 100% related to all the geopolitical factors, which is COVID, worsening US-China relationship, and a bunch of other economic reasons. So, and you can see, regardless of all of these decline, actually there is still quite a large number of Chinese students in the United States. Then I want to bring you to an earlier trend. This data is a little bit older, so it's from 2005 to 2015. And this was trying to show, the number of Chinese students in the US, the trend of the Chinese students getting younger and younger coming to the United States. So on the top left, you will see, the number of Chinese students enrolled in American secondary schools has a sharp increase from 2005 to 2015, from a couple of hundreds to, more than 40,000. And then at the same time, other international students, so non-Chinese international student doesn't have a similar trend. So it's a very unique phenomenon around that time. And the bottom right, you can see even at the undergrad level and graduate level, you can see there was, a bit of convergence around 2013, which also means that in general, there's more undergrad students coming to US. Which is, I think, corresponded to maybe the majority of our, panelists' experience, right? Because I think growing up, it is more likely that your classmates will think about going to the States after college or on scholarship. And now it is, for quite a while, it became a viable choice before college. And that really corresponds to what Ruixue has shared with us about, how it became an alternative path alongside Gaokao. And that has a lot to do with this increase in, economic wealth that these families can have, right? Because at the undergrad level, it is less likely to have fellowship money. So most of these families need to afford the education using their own, wealth, income, salary, whatever that means. So this also, I guess, has quite a lot to do with what we're going to discuss later in terms of, the rising wealth of the Chinese, especially Chinese urban families. And I think some of this, there is a side note which corresponds to what Ruixue has mentioned earlier on hukou, because some of my interlocutors, they actually send their kids to US for private high schools because although the parents work in big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou, but their kids don't have hukou from those cities. So they actually cannot attend selective high schools, the quote unquote best high schools in those cities. So the American high school became like alternative pathway that they aspire, they still can achieve greatness. On the other hand, we will discuss a bit later as well as, of course, this alternative pathways for those who choose American high school is also really a way to escape Gaokao, especially some students might just not do so well in school, academically, but they also want other versions of high school education beyond taking exams, like participating in sports and arts and other activities, these so-called more extracurriculum thing that they have this idea of becoming a Renaissance man, coming from the U.S. liberal education tradition. And some of those parents might get the idea from the Chinese version of 素质教育or 全面发展, right? That's like we need to develop fully from all different aspects, which actually the majority of Chinese educational system doesn't really offer that. So some of those families will decide to choose another route to pursue the same educational ideal that were inserted into their minds. So the last graph I want to show is also more or less a COVID graph. Can you still see it? Okay, yeah, sorry. So this is more or less a COVID graph. So you can see this decline in the US students coming to the US, which I already mentioned earlier in the first graph, but you can also see there is some rising trend, which doesn't mean that Chinese families are not sending their children abroad or Chinese students no longer want to, leave China for education. It just kind of show a more diversified choice now for students. So you can see there's increase in Australia, Japan, South Korea, and also there is a little bit of regional shift, right? Kind of decentering the original, US or Canadian, this North American-based school choices, but there's some shift to other countries, especially where I'm currently based in Germany. You can also see there's an increase because what Ruixue mentioned earlier about this focus on STEM makes lots of people shifting to Germany and Japan for STEM education. And I think another thing which is interesting that didn't show in this graph is the future plans of these international students, which we potentially can talk a bit more, as the previous generation of international students coming to the US, the majority of them at least want to stay for a little bit, if not longer, eventually become an, migrant in the United States and, becoming whether US citizen or permanent resident in the US, which is no longer that desirable in the current world. So I think there is a narrative around, people no longer believe in globalization, no longer open to the world, but there is also a little bit reverse narrative, which is on this shifting belief in geopolitical order and how you imagine the world to be. So many people become a little bit more pragmatic in terms of they want to get a degree or they want to spend less on a degree so they can optimize their investment in education, which makes some of the European and Southeast Asian options more desirable because they are cheaper than, Canadian or US degrees, and they might as well have somewhat similar effect in terms of the career perspectives and others. So I think I will stop here and I look forward to have a fruitful conversation with both of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tu. This is great. Now we have like a very comprehensive look of both domestic higher education and, Chinese students seeking higher education abroad. So my first question for my panelist is, how do you view education's function as an equalizer of the society? So domestically, right, is Gaokao, it was invented as a sorting machine largely based on merit, right? Does it still carry that merit now that we see how much Chinese families invest before Gaokao for years? So is Gaokao still providing like equal opportunities or compensate for structural disadvantage, for the bottom 50% of income earners in China and rural residents in China? And on the other hand, we see all of these, upper middle class sending their children abroad. And Dr. Tu was explaining part of it is to bypass Gaokao, but does it also reflect, a disillusion of college education quality in China? And does that mean that if you have an overseas degree, nowadays you go back China, does that give these children advantage over Chinese educated in Chinese universities? Maybe we'll begin with Dr. Jia.
Oh, okay. I think it's useful to keep in mind a counterfactual, like the exam system in China, the Gaokao has a lot of problems. We were before the webinar, the three of us were talking about it. It's a painful, memory in some sense. We are survivors of the system. That said, it's important to ask what is the counterfactual without this system. What would China be better or worse, right? So then to come back to your question, to think about equalizer or social mobility rule of education, there are two stages. One is if you are from a poor family, can you go to a good college, an elite college, right? That's what economists call accessibility. Then the second stage is if you go to a good college, would you earn more, right? And the social mobility is basically a multiplication of these two. If I'm from a poor family, I'm more likely to go to elite college. After that, I earn more, and that helps me basically catch up with my peers from richer families. So we did some research along these two questions. The first is, yes, Chinese system is unequal. So if you look at the probability of going to elite college, let's use the top 100 college. That's called 211, the 211 colleges in China. So about less than 5% of people of that age, from 19 to 22, could go to that college. So it's a small, right, for everywhere. That said, if you are from richer families, say the top 20 percentile of families, you are still much more likely to go to that college than poorer case. Like the ratio would be about 3 times higher. Of course, if you go to look at the top 10 or look at Beida, Tsinghua, the slope would be even higher, right? But then the question would be, what if China had a different system? Would it be better? One comparison is to compare with the US, and they're very even better data in the US context. If you do the same calculation and also look at top 100 colleges in the US, which include the typical elite college and the state flagship of colleges, and the ratio from the richer top 20 percentile compared with the bottom 20 percentile is 11 times. So I just want to say that, yes, the exam system is unequal already, especially with families invest a lot in their children. But if without such a system, perhaps it would be even worse. I think that explains why, Chinese obsessed with this exam system. not because they like it, they see a lot of limitations with this system, but they fear the alternative, right? Without this system, it's be even more unequal, right? And that's like why people complain about this Xiehe case, right? They make people so angry. They are so angry about these film stars whenever they enjoyed some loops in this system, right? This all reflect this sentiment. It's about the problem of the alternative. That's the first thing about accessibility. So it's unequal, but it's relatively actually more equal than the US counterpart. Then how about going to end up with elite college? Would that change your income? The answer is yes, still, especially going to elite college. I think nowadays when you talk about the illusion, the college is not diploma, it seems not very valuable. It's partly because of this large expansion. Now it's not too difficult to go to a college. 85% of exam takers would end up with some college. So this is a huge difference than the 1970s. Like 5% of exam takers could go to college, right? Now it's 85 could go to a college. Yet the go to the top tier is still very selective, right? So now the computation is about this hierarchy, whether my child could go to end up with a elite college, right? And still less than 5%, as I said, could end up with, say, the top 100, right? And it still matters, in our research, we compare just people with one score, 1 point below and above the first tier cutoff, right? That's by luck, given that the total score is 750. I just have 1 point above, and that's already made a difference in my 4 years later in my first job when I look at the salary. So to make a difference. Again, but there's a subtle point when you talk about mobility. I don't want to go too academic. So there's point you earn high wage, right? That is true. But there's another point that change how your parents affect you. Like, in every society, on average, richer parents have richer kids, right? This slope, this parental influence changed by you have 1 point above the elite cutoff. The answer, at least according to our data, is not. So it's not that really, it's in that sense, in terms of this intergenerational mobility, sociologists and economists are interested in that slope is what people care about is how your father affect you, how your mother affect you. That influence is not altered by the luck of ending up with the elite college. So in general, if you think, if you ask a very high aim, say, does the exam system levy the playfield? Which means after I go to a good college, my parental background doesn't matter at all anymore. The answer is no, it's not so ideal, right? But everything is relative here, right? If we think about, we see the problem, the inequality, but how to address the inequality does not necessarily imply you should abolish this system. It maybe implies some other policy that to address this inequality, right? Rather than say, let's adopt the US system, which would, I imagine, be disaster for the Chinese society. I shut up for now and let Xing share her ideas.
Yeah, I guess I will answer more on the question related to the upper middle class. I think, for example, in my research, those upper middle class who send children to US for private high schools, they definitely, whether intentionally or non-intentionally, they bypass Gaokao, right? And also, but the interesting side note of that this is also a policy thing is they also, even if they want to participate in Gaokao, they don't have the right to do it, since they didn't, like attend Chinese high school system, because there is an alternative thing in South Korea that lots of elites like to send their kids to US for private high schools, to learn English well, to acquire certain, culture and transnational capitals through this version of education, but they will actually go back to attend Gaokao, their version of college entrance exam in South Korea, so they can still enter the top elite universities in South Korea, which is their version of elite reproduction. A US degree doesn't necessarily give them more advantage than the local elite college, because that means lots of things to connections and social resources. So I think use that as a comparison point, it will help us to understand this question about Chinese upper middle class families. I think they do this thing for many different options, which many different reasons, which I explained a little bit earlier, is when you asked about the quality of education, right? It's kind of interesting because the quality of education is more or less imagined. Because for these parents, they also have not experienced either US high school or college education. The majority of them have zero experience of that, but they did imagine the quality of education to be different from at least the Chinese universities, and they imagine that, you know, it has a more versatile, well-grounded choices, which doesn't only pays attention to academic achievement, but also to other aspects of human development. So that is one of the reasons why some of them choose that. And then there's also other reasons, which I mentioned earlier, is, you know, academically you can be, for example, the stereotype of Chinese being good at math or whatever, right? So some of the students actually are really bad at that if they are in a Chinese school system. But then in the States, they might be able to bypass that disadvantage by, you know, doing well on other things. So they have other choices. So I think that fundamentally show the differences, what both education systems values, and that kind of like produce very different students' body. But on a more practical matter, whether their degree will grant them advantage is another question. And I think that changes all the time. For quite a while, a US degree still still have a slight advantage in China. It's like, okay, the students will speak better English, you know, the student has some foreign knowledge or embodied knowledge of how to carry themselves, how to act in specific business settings that makes them very desirable, and, you know, especially in transnational corporations. But we all know that at this particular time, that first, lots of foreign companies are leaving China, and the skills are a bit less valued. And secondly, lots of locally trained Chinese students are pretty good in their English skills and other things. So this advantage is more or less more diminished, while the disadvantage of the degree has certain things, right? Because some companies will say, oh, we want you to be more grounded, 接地气. So they assume a student who are trained abroad that doesn't have enough local knowledge to carry business or to understand how things work in the Chinese setting. So now the so-called payoff of these degrees start to, you know, decline a little bit. That's why lots of family, at least from a more practical matter, has a second thought on that. And I think Richard mentioned first degree, like this first degree program thing earlier, right? Because for some of the HR, the human resources managers, they also care deeply about this, and they also have a more holistic knowledge of what U.S. colleges are better than others, right? Because if we dial back time 10 years, 20 years, then maybe lots of the local companies don't have an idea of which university. For example, a good university like UCSD, they probably have never heard of, but now they have a very thorough understanding of where this university is positioned on U.S. News ranking. So that makes them a bit more sophisticated, but at the same time makes it harder for those students to just say, oh, I have a US degree that, you know, puts me on top of the career ladder. But I would also say there are still certain positive note on that in terms of some local city government like Shanghai. They have still grant hukou for some of the foreign degree holders, so easier to, you know, get an entrance into the city to have a household registered status in the place. So it's still like quite a lot of balancing work for the students, but it is definitely way more complicated than it was before. Because earlier it might be a easier, you know, evaluation of which has more advantage or which not. Now I think it's a very complicated and sophisticated, you know, balancing for students and for their families to think which is the better choice.
So following up on these discussions, would you expect a change in preference for studying in China or going abroad for, an average 17-year-old Chinese student? Particularly now when we think about the job market, right? The Chinese government, particularly for jobs in, if you want to work for the Chinese government, you want to work for a lot of the state-owned enterprises, banking industry, they now will explicitly say that they prefer candidates with a Chinese undergrad degree at least, right? So would that change Chinese students' preference for going abroad, at least by major? Will we say maybe, the STEM students are more likely to go abroad, but social science and humanities students now in China might have less preferences to do that?
Yeah, maybe I can start and Siqi maybe know even more about this. So I think in my research, I did a little bit look at US visa data and look at how Chinese students decline across universities, etc., and at a very individual, detailed level. And we see similar patterns as the aggregated data Siqi shown that there is definitely a decline, and it's very uneven by fields, by institutions, etc. That said, coming to Ning, your question about the preference, I still feel I echo Siqi's point. There is a lot of demand for foreign education because the Chinese pool is so large. There could be compositional change, like the very good students might change their mind to stay at Tsinghua, let's say. I do see this quality. I visit Chinese university every year. I do see that the student quality, especially among graduate students, is increasing across, over time, related to the fact they are less likely to come abroad. That said, because it's such huge pool, if US that doesn't have the visa limitation, I still think there'll be much more students coming to the US. And if another way to look at this is look at the GRE takers. This number as a rough proxy about how people wants to go abroad if they have the opportunity. And that is still increasing. So it's not that declining. But that said, there's compositional change, right? The who chose to come abroad is very different from the previous years. And related to Siqi's point, even though a small part of parents or families in their case abroad, maybe for education quality or values, etc. But I imagine a large part is still for labor market outcomes, right? You want to have a good job either abroad or go back to China. And as you said, indeed, the degree, the value of foreign degree changed a lot, especially for non-elite degree. The elite ones are still fine. I feel this is a very salient in the UK case, right? If you're a graduate from Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, you are still fine probably. But there's huge amount of UK university get a kind of basically a large negative shock with the Chinese labor market response to UK degree, and similar to the US. So there's a big division among your elite degree abroad versus non-elite universities abroad, etc. So that part, because the labor market response, I think that decreases the part of the family's readiness to spend so much on their kids, right? It's very expensive to study in abroad, especially in the US and in the UK. So there's a composition change, I think, but not in terms of quantity change.
Yeah, I think I also I agree with majority of what Rachel has mentioned earlier, and especially in terms of the labor market piece, I think it's kind of interesting in my research, especially with these upper middle class families, is for a while they don't really care about, it's not that they don't care, but it's not their top concern about labor market because they already know that the kind of investment they put into their children's education, which is 4 years of American high school, 4 years of US education, most likely 2 years of advanced degree, which is 10 years of US education that can easily cost $500,000 US. That's a lot of money. So they know that their kids are not going to pay them back with their salaries. So because this is not going to be financially, it's not going to be a good investment. So they care about other things, but that doesn't mean they don't want their kids to have stable jobs, right? They just don't necessarily like depend on their kids to have high paying job as an outcome of this education. But with that said, I still think lots of there's like two different ways to look at it. One is from the Chinese policy side, which Ning mentioned earlier about Chinese government are pushing certain major that they are encouraged to study abroad, right? A STEM major, and certain majors they are not necessarily so encouraged, like social sciences and humanities. And I think that also has some issue to do with the complicated geopolitical issues that we kind of like hinted around, right? Because some of the times it will evoke the question of loyalties, and this whole complicated identity issue. Which side are you on? Who do you identify with? And your positionalities. So I think that makes things quite complicated. But from a more ground level side, so coming from the students and the families, I think there's also something about the individual interests. So especially in my research, because of these people, students coming from a relatively better off families, they have a bit more flexibilities in choosing what they like. And lots of them start from, and they have better language skills because they went to American high school. So it's more likely for people, students, young people in my research that they choose social science and humanities, which is very unlikely for the majority of Chinese international students back in the day. So if you look into the data trend, you can also see an increased number of Chinese students choosing social science and humanities coming to the US. It has a lot to do with, I guess, increasing financial status of their family, which means, because we all know the job perspective for these different majors are quite different. And another thing is the increasing, language and cultural skills that makes them more likely to, achieve better in those majors, which requires very intensive reading and writing and conversational skills. So I guess I will stop there and looking forward to talk more. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're talking about, Chinese students coming, going abroad, and we're in the US. So Risha, you have, Chinese students, Siqi, you even studied this group since they're 14 years old. What is the interaction like between Chinese students and the US education system? Like, what do Chinese students, how do they affect the system? And then how do they adapt to the system? Do they change? Like, is there some aspects that they're particularly good at adapting and other aspects they maybe fall behind? What's your observation of this?
First, I feel social media played a large role in the interaction. For good or for better or for worse, it's actually make the integration a bit more difficult, right? Because once if you moved to the US in the 1990s, then you were forced to get integrated, right? But now you came to the abroad, you still use WeChat and all this old network. I feel I talk with my Chinese students, of even myself, I would say, not only my students. It's you have already your own network, and you feel you're not forced to get integrated with the new network. So that's a kind of a not. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but that's a reality. I feel even my Chinese students often hang out with the other Chinese students. I encourage them to get integrated more, but it's not easy, right? It's also mutual. And it's also a problem for myself, I would say. Like and in terms of graduate students, I teach more the graduate students, and they needed to do research. I think a major challenge they face from growing up in the exam system, being a good student, to doing research, a major change would be starting questioning the authority and starting challenging the existing literature. And that, a main part in my own teaching, trying to just interact with students, encouraging them to do so. I feel it's not too difficult once they have this the mindset of what research is like. They can adapt pretty well. Overall, I'm very impressed with the student quality, at least. So I don't feel, you hear this. You often hear people say the exam system kills creativity. I discuss this among my Chinese students as well because I don't want them to have this stigma of, oh, I'm good at the first 2 year of courses, working on my exam. I'm not very good if once I need to write a paper. I think that's a stigma rather than the reality. So once you have this open discussion, I found it's not too difficult to change and adapt. But the social networking part it's not easy. It's not easy for me, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I will echo the social media thing, and I will even add on like what actually Rachel used on her first slide about the ChatGPT, right? Because I feel like that also tremendously changes how Chinese students interact with foreign institution. Because when you're writing your paper, when you're like lots of stuff you previously might turn to help to a human, your English teacher, your professor, and your other fellow classmates. Now you might turn to a chatbots for help, and they most likely are more efficient, but that also kind of removes the human interaction that used to happen, in these kind of interaction. And I think in my research, when I hang out with all these Chinese students coming to the US, there are different trends. Of course, there's always a spectrum, right? How you interact or how you so-called adapt or try to change the institution that you're embedded in. There are different spectrum, and there are certainly some are becoming. We didn't talk really about American racialization phenomenon. So I think most of the Chinese students coming to the US, they will realize they're racialized into the system, right? They're either going to be read as a Chinese or Asian or some international, like basically a version that you are not the majority of the society, which is new to these students, because if you've grown up in China as a Han Chinese, then you're the majority. You never think about that specific piece of your life. So I think lots of them will have different strategies, how they racialize into the specific system. Some of them became more what I call reactionary ethnicity, right? So you became more Chinese or became more quote unquote patriotic about your own country. And then you also can choose to solely interact with your, co-ethnics. And it's really easy these days, especially with the large majority of Chinese students living in the United States. It's not very hard for you to find your, co-ethnic peers. But there's also other versions which I think they try to, for example, find solidarities with their other international students. So it's very likely that some of the students, their best friends are not other American students, but other international students who are not Chinese. So I think that is like a very large spectrum of differences. But I guess there's also something that usually politically, some university will evoke about, Chinese students being more confident of what they believe in or what China has taught them. So, for example, we just are still in the middle of the Chinese New Year, right? So there's, of course, lots of debate on whether we should call it Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, blah, 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 right? So these are also kind of show that, whether we don't need to have a judgment on that, but we can see there is like more voice coming from these people, these students or those who reside outside of China that want to have a say. And then, of course, there's different, political events that both China-trained students or, more US-based students will have different understanding of how those things are. So I think those are all, points of contestation, and they're becoming more common, I would say, because the stereotype is Chinese students are really, quiet and not social, not very social. And with the newer generation of students, that is changing, but also the newer generation of students also grown up in a slightly different political environment. So you will see they have very different understanding on certain things. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with both of you. I noticed the same thing about creativity that Risha was talking about. Even though my students coming from China, a lot of them even went through undergrad in China. Even though the Chinese education system, has that a little bit of the teaching to the test flavor because of Gaokao, it doesn't mean that individual creativity will be necessarily, get lost in the system. They come to the US, they go into social science program. Actually, very quickly you can see creativity. And I also agree with Siqi. I was, happily noticing that a lot of stereotype is definitely not true. Many of my Chinese students are naturally born like really good at leadership, at interpersonal, all of these relationship English superb. So I thought that was really interesting, encouraging to see. But so I think I would ask my last question before I turn it over to the audience. And we already have questions waiting in the chat. So the last question is, do you both think that Chinese attitude towards higher education has changed? I'm asking this because anecdotally, I've encountered, more than a few cases where people are kind of disillusioned in the system, in their faith in meritocracy in China. And this corresponds with the rapidly rising unemployment level in China. And also their faith in the return to education seems to be diminishing in these anecdotal cases. So I wonder if you have observed any trend in change of Chinese attitude towards education. We could start with maybe Siqi on this one.
Yeah, sure. I think I probably mentioned in our practice session, I don't have empirical data to answer that specific question, but I would say, and I'll be curious if Rachel has some data to support that argument. I think there might be some class differences in terms of whether people's attitudes towards higher education has changed. I have a speculation is on the highest income level and the lowest income level you will care less about higher education. Because if you're on a lower income level, you feel like whatever you do, you're not going to succeed in the system. So you're kind of like lost hope in it. But there also could be a thing that you don't have other options. So this is still the only way that you have the slightest chance to climb up the class ladder a little bit. And on the highest income level ladder, which is some of the families that I interact with, I think it's not that they no longer care about education, but I think they care less about which schools their children are going to, because they know they're not gonna secure a job through that degree anymore. So, and some of them are preparing to basically support their kids throughout their life with their family wealth. So they will say, you do whatever you want, because I also have been encountering some of the students who have some, psychological and mental issues after, being abroad for so long and have lots of depression disorder and things like that. So for these families, they were like, as long as you're alive, you're, eating and sleeping and, being around every day, I'm happy that you don't have to, so I feel like there is quite a lot of differences. And I have some speculation for certain families that might be the new norm, that they know whatever their children is going to enter the job market, the salary is not gonna be high enough to sustain them. So they're ready to this whole idea of full-time daughters and full-time sons, right? The parents are ready to support their children for the rest of their life with their own family wealth. So they will start to loosen up a little bit on that. But I mean, it sounds very depressing, but then I feel like for others who don't have that means it's still like Richard has mentioned earlier, it's not an ecosystem, but it might still be your only option that you have certain leverage in the future labor market.
Yeah, so for social scientists, it's always very difficult to observe the richest, say 1% or the very poor 1%. They are out of our data, right? We cannot reach these people. They are always different, I feel, right? They always have other, especially the rich one, they always has other means. That said, I think for the 95% of the society, despite all these complaints and discussion of lying flat about this, class decline of social mobility, etc., which are all true, which calls for reform of this current system, right? I see a lot of problem with this system. But in terms of attitude, I feel one data point is to look at the tutoring industry, right? It's boom, even though it was kind of banned, and then secretly now it's booming again. And even my, friends who are often college professors, they have to send their kids to the tutoring classes, right? They know it's a tournament, but if they don't do it, they cannot catch up. They'll be lagging behind in class. And this all together still suggests the society is still, kind of invest a lot in this computation. And it's kind of rational, especially with economic slowing down. As I said, with economic slowing down, the state sector jobs are becoming even more valuable, right? The unemployment is less of concern there. And then for state sector, credentials is even more important because for private sector, at least they can measure your productivity some way. But state sector is actually your credentials is even more important. And that means Gaokao as a sorting mechanism, sorting machine you mentioned in the beginning is even more powerful, at least in the short run and medium run. In the long run, of course, I don't know with AI, with the politics, with all this in geopolitics, I don't know what would happen. But in the short run, medium run, I would say it's even more important, which means actually the government, this is ultimately a centralized system. The good news is that the government has a lot of capacity to reform if it wants to. So I hope there could be, some reforms to improve this system in the coming years. Yeah.
And I would suggest people to read the highest exam to see what kind of policy, proposals there might be to reform the system. But can I add one more question? As we're talking about the tutoring industry, what's your take on why did the Chinese government, crack down on this industry in around 2021? What were they hoping to achieve?
I think like in many other scenarios, the government realized the problem but didn't find the right solution. This happens often in politics, right? That they know that this system has too much burden on families. They know it's unequal, right? Tutoring is a major driver of inequality because richer families has much more resources for tutoring. So they want to ban this to say, oh, this might help in terms of equality. But we know this is there's a supply and a demand. So the demand is there. You just say, let's restrict the supply. It wouldn't work because it's backfired, right? Tutoring still going on, but went underground. Maybe it's even more unequal. So the government has to step back, right? It just silently let it boom again. So this is the example to say you find the problem, but prescribe the wrong solution. So that's my interpretation of the behavior and this silent retreat from this policy.
Understood. Siqi, would you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it was a response to the increasing rat race that Gaokao has caused. But as we already know, that it actually wasn't the right solution to that. And I guess echoing what Rachel has said, I actually make it more salient because I know lots of, wealthier families start to have private tutors. They put these, previous tutors into their home, right? So it became more and more expensive and they have access to the after school tutoring while others don't for quite a while. So it's, that was how it proceeded, I think.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. And I on top of that, I find it very interesting that the shutdown of the tutoring industry corresponds with the deepening demographic crises when the state is trying to encourage people to have more children. So maybe they're paying more attention to, education burden on parents. But let's open it up to the audience now. So audience, if you have any question, at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a Q&A where you can put your question into, and then we'll present it to our panelists. So we have two questions here already. The first one is from Jacob Knack to Professor Tu. He asked Professor to talk briefly about the idea of being well-rounded in education and learning skills like art, music, etc. Could she mention what idea was called again for the non-Mandarin speakers and potentially go into a little more detail on the idea?
Yeah, so in the Chinese education lingua franca, there was a word called 素质教育, which 素质 basically, if you translate it directly, it is quality. And things like like related to that, there's a term saying that we need to support the all-round development in 5 areas: moral, intellectual, physical, aesthetic, and labor education. So that was the state lingua franca on, how education should be all-rounded. But we all know that with the, long-standing Gaokao as the milestone ahead of you, all of these narrative on well-rounded education is a bit limited and constrained from the school side because their ultimate achievement is evaluated through that. But there is also, small attempts always trying to incorporate some of the sports exam into the college exam, or give you additional scores if you are excelling in certain arts and things like that. But everything eventually turns into what Rachel actually mentioned, the centralized hierarchical tournament. Everything, even if it's not academic race, then it's other race, but it has a very similar structure. So it didn't really achieve this ideal of, develop human quote unquote quality 素质 through all these different area of education. Yeah.
And then we have a second question from Harley Balzer. The Chinese government has become increasingly more forceful in developing policies to encourage families having more children. Yeah, we were just talking about this. Has there been any discussion of the high private share, the cost of education, influence the declining interest in having more than one child? Maybe we can start with Rachel for this question.
We haven't done research. I think this is a very good research question. I imagine the answer is yes, but it's to what degree? There's some research actually done in South Korea, which find suggestive evidence that this, it's equally competitive in the South Korea exam system. They said the South Korea also have even lower fertility rate than China. And there's some research showing that there's a link there. I imagine it's also part of the story in the Chinese case. It's just very costly to have children and have more children. So I think it's an excellent, research project. So far, I haven't done it, but if any of you are interested, I think it's a very good topic to be studied, with the evidence. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a very excellent research project, and I think that is also you can see that Rich already mentioned that the low fertility rate in China is partly related to the high cost of educational investment, right? Lots of family will say, I cannot afford to have more than one kid because they know how much it takes to raise a kid. And in my research about, this sending kids to private high schools, it was also for me a particularly historical thing because it was still the one-child policy. They are still the children from the one-child policy period. So the family can pull all their resources onto one child. So now if there are certain families that have different, 2 or 3 kids, then we probably can potentially there will be some nice research project out there to design and, observe whether individually they invest less in each kid and how that maybe even emotionally whether they have different lower pressure on each child, right? Because I guess that's the part which is a little bit hard to be quantitatively documented, but quite important in parental education, right? Is about how much pressure you put on one child when you only have one child. If you have more, does that mean that you can loosen up a little bit? Maybe they will have, more relaxed and happier environment, regardless of what other factors we have been talking about.
And we know that increasing, birth rate is such a difficult and complicated systematic, right, project it comes with. gender equality, labor benefits, social welfare. It's such a complicated project. It's interesting though, like I don't know if you two notice any other government measure to try to, increase it. The only thing I noticed is basically to give monthly stipends, and this is very much like at the policy experiment phase in certain rich cities, to just give cash out if a couple has the second or the third child. But I don't know how much that will help, particularly as Rachel was mentioning, South Korea, Singapore, they all try that with limited avail to. So I wonder about it too. Is there any more question from the audience? These are fantastic discussion from our panelists. As someone who is, marching into this area, trying to do a survey project to understand Chinese college and grad students' experience in the West, this has been very informative and educational to myself. And one thing I do wonder about is whether, because I'm in social science, right? So one concern of mine is to see a declining trend of students of social science to come to the US when it becomes much, much more difficult for them to stay in the US, but also more difficult for them to get a job in China. So I find it particularly interesting on the future trend of overseas education for Chinese students. If no questions from the audience, any last remarks from our panelists to conclude this panel? Rachel, should we start with Rachel? Concluding remarks.
Yeah, just thanks for the opportunity. I feel it's such an important topic. I just welcome more scholars and young students to think more about this, especially how to change this system, right? We know there are a lot of problem, but it's not easy to change such a system. So any new idea would be actually valuable. And I also see similar problem in the US education system. It's also very hierarchical, very unequal, etc. And even though these are two very different political systems, right, how should we think about them together? Anyway, it just keep me, at least I'm keeping thinking. So I look forward also to reading Siqi and Ning's work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this panel. It's also a great learning opportunity for me to think through some of the issues that I have been thinking about for a while. And I think it's really interesting what Rachel mentioned earlier. After moving to Germany, I increasingly realized how China and the US are very similar in many ways, because I guess we were trained to think, okay, China and US, two great global power, whatever, that they're so different. But after moving to other countries, have other experience, I think you will really see that, the kind of, and I want to point out one specific thing that is really related to education is the success frames of, individuals, right? How you consider tied into your success, to your educational credentials, to your career perspective, to how much you earn in your life, which is also deeply related to the kind of social systems these both countries are creating. While if you look at some of the European states, it might be slightly different in terms of how people view success, and eventually, as we are moving towards a more, in my research method, more qualitative field, and I will talk about, how people see their idea of a good life, right? Eventually, it is about how do you want to live a good life, and this whole educational story, whether we talk about inequality and merits, eventually humans do these things to have their life, and it's just one piece of it. And I think it's really interesting that both countries, US and China, seems to create a narrative that's more single-mindedly focusing on certain aspects of it and rather than other aspects to it. So I feel like it's very interesting to have more comparisons from different regions and, have more conversation with different scholars who are working on this issue to have a holistic view of it.
Hey, I couldn't agree more with that. Yes. How do we measure success and what do we pursue is very much shaped by both the culture and economic level and the education system. So that is one important thing to understand. I will encourage our audience to check out Ruixue's great book, The Highest Exam. And then we're all going to wait for Siqi's book coming out very soon, hopefully. And then those will be two wonderful contributions to our understanding to education in China. And again, thank you so much, Ruixue and Siqi, for joining us for this panel. And we learned a lot from you too. And thank you to the audience. And please keep posted with our upcoming events with the U.S.-China Initiative.